We're on our very last section of materials, and now we'll begin talking about love and lust. We're going to consider some of the theories behind love, as well as some of the most recent science that has tried to understand what is happening when we fall in love. What are the biological processes that our body go through, and what kinds of psychological changes happen? So you might think about the song from the 1975 era, the song by Roxy Music, Love is the Drug.
The toll of the bell. I drove bitches fast today. I drove downtown, the red light blaze. Just a bubble of what's in store. Love is the drug that leads the door. Showing out, hit and run. Boy, meets girl when the beats are done. Stitched up tight, can't take free. Love is the drug or the hook on me.
So are we really drugged when we fall in love? Well, not exactly, but you could make the argument that the body does go through some dramatic psychological changes, and you feel like you are taking a drug. We'll explore that during this unit. We'll look at the difference between love and infatuation or lust. We'll look at the behaviors that are linked to flirting and try to understand some of their roots in biology and issues of body smell and symmetry too. But first, let's talk about the theorists and how they defined love. So the early theorists in the 18th century tried to understand what love during marriage was all about. And don't forget that the idea of love being linked to marriage is fairly recent. During the 18th century, marriage was considered more of a partnership than a romantic relationship. In fact, love, or the heady sensations that we associate with love, those were thought to be somewhat of a tragic aberration. It was dangerous because you might make some very serious errors in judgment, and you could make some tragic choices in your life course. So it was a German physician, Richard von Krafft-Ebing, in the early 1900s that wrote about the difference between the kind of initial infatuation people may feel, or what he termed as a fleeting, purely sensual love, from what he described as the more true love that happens over the course of many years, and the difference from sentimental love, platonic love, or just a strong friendship, the differences between those types of love. Then another theorist from England, who was also a physician, Havelock Ellis, he considered how people fell in love and what happened when that experience matured. And he defined love as something that would occur between men and women, and that their experience really was a mixture of lust, i.e. infatuation, or what he called the physiological sexual impulse, combined with friendship, and that these emotions and experiences would also include other impulses of a more tender and affectionate nature. And Ellis, he also wanted to address romantic love, which he differentiated from the more mature love that occurs in a long-term relationship. Ellis considered infatuation and determined that this kind of experience was not grounded in the reality of an actual relationship. He thought that romantic love was a fleeting or short-term experience and described it as the heady, perfectionistic, and overly idealized vision of the other person. Ellis concluded that long-term relationship love that was characteristic of a mature relationship that hopefully occurred during a long-term marital relationship between couples was not the first sensations of love that were experienced. Sigmund Freud, who arguably was somewhat focused on the sexual component of his subjects, he also addressed the concept of love. Hopefully, you recall our prior discussions of Freud and how he considered the component of the id, meaning the animalistic or the more primitive desires, and also that he used that concept of objectification in much of his writings. Objectification was a common theme for him. And what I mean by objectification is the act of treating an entity, such as a person or animal, as the object or thing, as though they were a possession of another, or as the instrument by which you can gain something that you want. So Freud believed that romantic love, which occurred when the sexual instinct inherent in all of us, and that's the id operating there, when it manifests itself as a psychical attachment to the current love object. So there you have it. Freud has now defined love in terms of the id and objectification. He thought that love occurred because having this primitive sexual urge, and again that's the id there, and that we had to suppress that primitive urge and sublimate it. And remember then that he had that latency phase, and that's when you learn to suppress all those primitive urges. So he thinks that we have to suppress the primitive urges, sublimate them through the latency phase, and that love was the result of suppressing the animalistic desire for sex. Theodor Reich was also a psychoanalytical theorist, and he trained also at the University of Vienna, the same institution where Freud developed his theories. He was highly regarded on the theory of love, and he has a wonderful quote that I'd like you to think about. We fall out of love not when we no longer sexually desire our beloved, but when the pedestal on which we have placed the individual eventually cracks and tumbles to the ground as a result of numerous disappointments that eventually taints any romantic relationship. So I think here that Reich is addressing what Ellis was talking about. That romance is a bit idealized, and the reality can never match the image that is in our minds. And I would think that many of you would feel that Reich's quote about the pedestal crumbling after the reality of the disappointment set in over time might to some extent match your own experiences. Remember that theories are supposed to explain, describe, and predict social phenomenon, and we might consider to what extent Reich has developed at least partial theory about intimate human relationships. Reich also theorized that love stems from the fusion of three distinct drives: the sexual desire or the sex urge, the will to conquer, and affection. So again, thinking about the idea of primitive drives, we can see how Freud's theory of psychoanalysis has helped to frame the concepts and theories of Reich's works well after Sigmund Freud has developed the initial theories. Another theorist, Erich Fromm, was very prominent in the 1950s. He developed a typology of human emotions, describing and explaining a broad range of emotions and feelings. So in understanding how he creates typologies, he looks at the difference between erotic love, brotherly love, or motherly love. He wrote a book called The Art of Loving, which was published in 1956 and was highly popular, becoming an international bestseller. Fromm also trained in Germany, but was a social psychologist, not a psychoanalytical theorist, as were Freud and Ellis. In the next section, we're going to shift gears a little bit and venture into the area that I mentioned earlier, which is lust or infatuation. To go there, we're going to start to talk about flirting behaviors and discuss what science knows about the language of love.